I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast usually about Christianity and leftist politics, and still a little bit this time around. I'm Dean Detloff.
And I'm Matt Bernico.
And this week we're talking with Andrew Choi, a musician who also performs under the name St. Lenox, Stlenox. We're chatting with Andrew about a new album that he has coming out this summer, and it plays with all kinds of really interesting themes related to Christianity and other religious traditions and the left here and there and science. And man, I listened to it at dinner time today. I've been listening to it for the last few weeks. It's really nice, really interesting stuff, and a neat little departure, I think, from what we usually do on the show.
Yeah, the album is called 10 Songs of Worship and Praise for Our Tumultuous Times. And I gotta tell you, folks, these times, they've been tumultuous, and this album, well, it doesn't change the times. It's still it's still tumultuous, but it's a good album just the same to listen to. Something that I really like about the album is that there's this theme that kind of runs throughout it about sort of the commonplaceness of things that might be miraculous or might be religious. And I love that kind of stuff. So it's a great album. You're going to love it. Stick around and listen to Andrew talk to us about it. All right, let's go to the interview. Today in the show, we have Andrew Choi from the band St. Lenox. Andrew, welcome to the show. Whenever we have someone new on the podcast, we just ask them to give a quick introduction of themselves and their project. So would you mind giving us a little bit about yourself and your music?
I'm Andrew Choi. I perform under the name St. Lenox. I've been a singer-songwriter for about 10 years, but I've been a musician in some form or another for most of my life, actually. I used to be a concert violinist many years growing up, and I guess at one point, when I went to college, I started pursuing philosophy for many years, where I was intending at one point to become a philosophy professor, but the job market sort of got the best of me. I got my PhD, but then quit and then became an attorney instead. But sort of being an attorney, I've kept up music in the meantime, I guess in the form of being a singer-songwriter. It gives me something else to do, which is not an office job, which is nice. But the name St. Lenox, it's really sort of an accidental name. It's a kind of misreading of a subway terminal, 148th Street Lenox Terminal. And I guess when the name came to me, it really was, because I had accidentally read the word St. Lenox into the subway sign. And so it really kind of struck me as sort of an interesting metaphor for sort of reading something of significance into kind of mundane things.
That's so cool to hear you explain it, and it makes sense, I think, after having listened to your music for the last few weeks, especially. A lot of really neat things that you do, neat themes that you pull together in your album seem to play with that sacred and profane mishmash really well. You have a new album, 10 Songs of Worship and Praise for Our Tumultuous Times. Seems like something everybody needs. It plays with a lot of religious themes. We want to draw out a bunch of stuff in the album, but maybe just to get started, it'd be nice to hear you talk about it a little bit. What brought you to write an album like this one?
Well, I think when I started writing music, I have a lot of like little writing projects in my head that are constantly going on, and I think I had this thought that there's a certain reputation that modern pop rock Christian praise music has, and so I was thinking about what would it's going to sound very mean. I don't mean it in this way, but what would it be to write something like praise music in a modern pop context, but is maybe something that sounds
good.
But it's something that certainly appeals to many people, but it also doesn't appeal to many people. In fact, it has the opposite effect. I've heard a fair bit of modern pop praise music in my time. I've driven frequently from the East Coast to the Midwest to visit my parents, and just driving through the Midwest in general, you're just going to run into modern pop praise music in general. Anyway, I was just thinking about sort of trying to just shake up or sort of rethink what that sounds like, and I wrote a number of songs. I think a few of the ones that I initially wrote ended up on the album, but I think what ended up is still something that it isn't exactly praise music, at least not in like the traditional sense, but I think it still retains a lot of the spirit of praise music. In any case, or at least that's what my intention is. And then after I'd written a number of tracks that went off in this direction that I found sort of very interesting, and I just sort of filled out the album, sort of took that trajectory and ran with it, and tried to sort of fill out a full album's worth of music that I think fit into that category.
I think it's a really interesting way to put it. Praise album, but not really a praise album. I think that actually really fits, having listened to it all a few times.
Well, that's good. I'm glad, because I was going to say, as somebody who isn't very much involved in the church or Christianity in general, the idea of writing something sort of that was Christian oriented or religious oriented, I think there's a natural insecurity that I have with the record, sort of like, giving it to someone. You're religious. Can you listen to this? What what do you think about it? So I'm glad that it came off that way.
I don't know the last time I have actually listened to like a Christian like pop praise band in any way other than very ironically or something. I don't know. It's been a pretty long time. But I think your album is really fascinating because it does it's not musically similar, though there are some similarities with your use of like this like very interesting organ kind of noise and some other synths and stuff. But something that does stick out to me as really interestingly religious about the album is the narratives of like very serious moments in people's lives throughout. And more than one song on the album is about a funeral even, and I think that's quite profound actually. You're writing music that is religious in a sort of way of thinking about moments in life that I think a lot of people wouldn't write a praise song about, right? There's not a lot of praise songs out there for funerals specifically. I don't know, like, what do you think is going on there? Like, was any of that kind of going through your head as you were writing it, or is that just kind of all happenstance?
Oh, a lot of that stuff was going through my head. I mean, a lot of the writing that I do, it is, I take some artistic license, but it is all autobiographical. And so, whenever I'm writing about any, like serious moments or moments of a lot of stress, you're supposed to write what you know. So I try and write from that perspective. And especially sort of trying to write religious music, I think at least I want to write something that I'm speaking honestly from my perspective, because I think it has more meaning for other people that way. But yeah, no, so like it actually wasn't until you said it that I realized that there were there are a lot of funerals in the record, which is I hadn't thought about that much. But yeah, no, in the track Deliverance, which is the opening track, the genesis of that song is that I had a coworker who died very suddenly before I was going to go on my honeymoon with my husband, and so because we were on our honeymoon, we couldn't attend the funeral. And then I guess coincidentally, I had several other funerals that I was going to that year, and I guess for context here, I basically had never been to a funeral before and was just stuck in this situation where I was suddenly going to a lot of funerals. And it was interesting for me because I hadn't really been in a general church context in quite some time. And so it was kind of by coincidence, by going to funerals, that I was suddenly put in a more religious context, which wasn't something that I was used to, but it did get me thinking a lot about, we were doing religious rituals and, singing and praying. And it did get me to think a lot about, why I had left, or if I had left. I still don't really know what to think about that. Or if I was going to come back, what would that look like? Why would I want to come back? And just sort of thinking about that type of situation.
Yeah, I'm glad that you bring up the song Deliverance. Well, let's take that as a nice segue into playing a clip of the song.
Jesse has said the winner usually sticks around, even if the groundhog doesn't see your shadow. Punxsutawney folk tables bullshit, Well, that's what I've always thought about religion. Lately, I can just feel the entropy after you race an unexpected passing. Thinking about that existential dip rush, I've been really thinking about deliverance now. Jesse, I must confess to you something secret just between you and I. Till now, I've been lucky in life to never have someone close to me ever die. But now that I'm 40 and in the middle of my life, talking about stuff like taxes and inheritance, serious subjects for a French attorney, unschooled in the heavy poetry of religion. I still remember the verse from the Bible to recite for you at your funeral today.
You said you don't know if you are back or want to come back or whatever it might be. I think a lot of people are kind of dealing with that similar issue. In the last maybe couple of decades, especially, but more particularly even the last just 4 years or so, let's say. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that. Hopefully this isn't too personal, but you mentioned having some kind of religious background, but you've also said you're not a religious person yourself, and yet the album is kind of full of all these religious themes. What is your history with that religious past? What's maybe drawing you back in? What drove you out? What's your relationship to that now?
I don't know. The thing is that probably because I spent 7 years as a philosophy graduate student. That you take any interesting concept and sort of as a philosopher you just poke it to death until it just becomes meaningless, and I guess that's sort of the position that I ended up after the stint as a philosopher. But I think that there are a lot of things that turn me off. That it's not going to be just one thing, but I think there were a lot of racial and cultural things. Not necessarily that like anybody that I had run into in the church was a complete and terrible racist. It's nothing like that. But growing up as a Korean American in the United States, like if you grow up in a religious context, and if you talk to other Korean Americans, I'm pretty sure they will tell you the same thing. You kind of grow up having two churches, or at least we had two churches. I had the Korean church that I went to, and then I had, for lack of a better word, sort of the white church that I went to. And so there's already something that's a little bit disorienting about sort of being religious as a Korean American growing up in the United States. And I think beyond that, something that recording the record made me think a lot about. But there was this point. So you can probably help fill in some of the gaps here. When I was growing up in the church, there was a certain point, I think around middle school, where a lot of the kids went off into this kind of like more formal religious education that they did. It was like a continuation of Sunday school, but like, the middle school and high school students started doing this separate track of like religious education that they were doing. Do you know what that is?
Yeah, like confirmation.
Yeah, that's what it's called. I was trying to remember the name of it. So I remember, being in high school, and I knew that there were other kids that were in the confirmation group, and I wasn't in that group. I don't know why. I don't think anybody really asked me to be in the confirmation group. I wasn't like raring to get into the confirmation group either, but I knew that they existed there. Some of them were like friends of mine in high school. I think one person, we actually went to junior prom together. So like I knew many of these people, but for some reason I wasn't in the group, and I was still very much involved in the church. I was, playing the violin, for services. I was going to service every Sunday. I helped to teach Sunday school. And, I was involved in, when you, what's the communion, you've got the wine cups and you've got the bread. I was helping to fill the wine cups before service. And then afterwards, taking the emptied wine cups to the kitchen to have them washed and dried and then sort of returned back. And there was this one moment. I'm still confused about like what happened or what it meant. But I was taking the wine glasses to the kitchen, washing them, putting through the washer, putting through the dryer, then taking the wine glasses back to be put in like the place where we stored them in between services. And lo and behold, this one time I was going through, one of the main halls, and I see all of my friends in the confirmation class, and they're celebrating a high school graduation. And they look at me, and I look at them, and I was like, "What are you guys doing?" And they were celebrating graduation of all the people that had been through like the confirmation class. And there was this moment where they suddenly felt super bad. They were like, "Oh, that's right, you're graduating high school as well. Come sit with us and we'll have, we'll hang out." And I had some food. There were like some extra graduation presents that they gave me, and it was fine. It wasn't like traumatic or anything, but I was sitting there, and I'm sure that they were also sitting there as well, sort of thinking, what the hell happened that this person who is is growing up with us that we know sort of went through this church experience with us, but somehow got completely cut off. And if it weren't for that situation, I don't think it would have become it would have become as obvious. But it did become very obvious that there was like a cultural gap of some sort that had ended up with that insane result. And I mean, I'm not saying that that's what caused me to leave the church, but I think it really illustrated the disconnect that was happening there. And I think back about it, and I think a lot of it was it's related to race and culture, and in some sense, because as the child of immigrants, I had instilled in me very much the idea that I was going to try and get into an Ivy League school. I was going to leave Iowa. I was going to do all these things afterwards. Who knows? And I'm sure that, in fact, I know for a fact that some of my church fellow people, what do you call them? Church fellow people, that they had in the cards for themselves that they were going to stay in Iowa and sort of do different things that were definitely not what I was doing. And I think that's very natural, but at the same time, and I guess this makes me think about sort of what the church is doing. Whatever unifying force the church had, it definitely wasn't enough to close that gap that had definitely opened up over the years between us.
It's such a great image of you doing all of that, the work of cleaning up after communion and like whatever, like you're materially doing it all, and then your friends are just kind of standing off, actually kind of participating. I love that. Yeah, it's really fun.
It was so weird because one of the people that was there was my date for the prom, and it was just very strange.
Yeah. I can appreciate that type of alienation, though. That's really interesting and pretty relatable, I think, as well. That actually makes me think. One of the lyrics that really sticks out on your album comes from a song called "Gospel of Hope," which I think is probably one of my favorites. The lyric is, "I'm not a religious man, but I can understand religion," and maybe that's actually really highlighted pretty well by this story, right? You're not a part of the in group at church, but at the same time, you know exactly what's going on with religion. You're the guy washing the cups. But yeah, I mean, I think that this speaks to maybe more than just your experience too. Dean and I, we do this podcast, and we hear from a lot of people who are, they're either religious people or they're people who have been, alienated or pushed away from, religion in one way or another. And now they're getting older and they're finding ways to come to terms with that religious background. So I guess as not a religious man, as the guy who is washing the communion cups, how do you understand religion? What do those lyrics mean for you?
Well, again, I guess as the philosopher, I have no clue what religion means. But that's kind of like with any abstract concept that I'm really just confounded with what that means. In the song, and I think throughout the record, but on that song especially, I think I'm really trying to understand religion, but at the same time, I guess maybe as a part of that journey, I'm trying to think very expansively about what religious experience could be. And so that song, at least for me, was a lot about thinking about what miracles are. And I have a number of situations, at least in my past, that I know people who experience with miracles has been something that has driven them to become religious. And so that served as kind of an entryway for thinking about how I could be religious, for lack of a better word. So like the first stanza sort of deals with my parents. Some of this is kind of imagined because I don't know what my parents' complete experience was, but I know that during the Korean War there was a point at which the U.S. forces, so the UN forces, thought that the North Korean and communist forces had driven the troops down pretty far south, and there was this maneuver that MacArthur had pulled that sort of dramatically reversed the trajectory of the war. and sort of thinking about that event as kind of a miraculous event. And so I was thinking about that and as being at least one factor that played a role in why my dad is a religious person. And in the third stanza, in particular, after the Korean War, my mom got tuberculosis, or I guess what they sometimes call consumption, and it was very common in Korea. In fact, there's studies about sort of how tuberculosis has sort of continued on in sort of various ways in the population there. But she had gotten tuberculosis, and many people who get tuberculosis end up dying. And so there was a point at which that it wasn't clear what was going to happen, but for some reason we don't know, she got better. And on top of that, the thing that she notes is that her lungs, there's usually like scar tissue that forms as a result of sort of going through tuberculosis, and she did not have any scar tissue on her lungs. And to this day, she declares that as being a kind of miraculous experience that is, definitely a part of her religious life now. And so, I was thinking about those experiences as things that are connected to me, about ways that I can, whether I'm religious or not, I can understand that as being a way in which I can have some affinity with that and understand what religion might mean to other people. And then the other two stanzas are just sort of thinking more expansively about, the idea of miracles and miraculous experience. So maybe, the poetry of the Bible is something that is very beautiful. Like maybe that's kind of miracle. And, maybe the beauty of nature is a kind of miraculous experience that can give people some acquaintance with religion. I don't know, but it doesn't sound insane to me. As a philosopher, it's hard for me to say, no, that's not a religious experience. I mean, I don't know what a religious experience is anyway, but that's what I was thinking about with that track.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. There's a sort of in a similar vein, there's a poet that we like to talk about a lot on this podcast. His name is Ernesto Cardenal. He was a priest in Nicaragua until he joined the Nicaraguan Revolution, which is a really fascinating thing. Anyways, he has a really similar idea about about the miraculous. He in his poetry, he kind of expresses it in the same sense that like it's amazing that it's miraculous that they were able to overthrow a tyrant and like kind of have this like liberative experience, right? So it's this sense of mapping on the miraculous onto places that might seem mundane to other people, or might seem very or even like sacrilegious to say, like in politics or something. But yeah, I mean a similar thrust maybe.
Yeah, no, that's interesting.
Well, kind of staying on these places where religion comes up in your songwriting, but switching gears perhaps a little bit. There's a video that you just put out for a track called "Arthur is at Shiva," and the song itself is another song about a funeral. But the video that goes along with it is also sort of a mashup of religious symbols and ideas. So in the video, there's a recipe for something that you call the Great Fractal Challah, and the recipe, as you call it, is a multicultural bread that puts together Jewish challah bread and Asian milk bread. Tell us a little bit about that video and what's going on there. What's going on with the Great Fractal Challah?
Well, I mean, I think like the basic narrative of the underlying song is it's kind of an accidental confrontation with religion, in this case, at least in the first stanzas, Judaism, and I think the video was meant to kind of play off that. Except, I guess with the video, I mean, the video is, I guess in many ways, also about a kind of incidental sort of confrontation with Judaism. In this case, sort of, after I met my husband, I would visit his parents and have meals and, celebrate Passover and Hanukkah and, say blessings at the table. And that was, especially Judaism, that was something that I had never really participated in or gotten involved in. And so it was kind of a way in which I kind of accidentally was confronted with this new experience or this new way of interacting with religion. But anyway, so during the pandemic, we ended up staying with his brother, my brother-in-law, his brother, and his family, and we were doing a lot of cooking at home for obvious reasons, and they were baking bread, so baking challah, and I started to get involved, and eventually started to bake bread myself. And I will say, like, I cook all the time. I love cooking, but bread is something that had always been somewhat intimidating for me because I don't like being super exact, and I like to taste things as I'm going along to help me, determine what tastes good. And you can't really do that with bread. You kind of have to like follow instructions and whatnot. But it was interesting because there is a process for baking challah. There's not just the recipe, but there's a part where you take part of the dough and like I think you burn it. So there's a lot of religious significance involved in making the challah. And I guess the thought was that I learned how to bake bread. I learned how to bake challah, and I of course wasn't going to be staying with my brother-in-law forever. I would eventually go home, and I guess the thought was, what do I do with this tradition and this ritual that I have become involved with? Is it something that I, continue on like in the exact form that I had, or that I received it? Is it something that I kind of like take and make my own? Is it something where if I don't change it, I'll leave it as it is? Is it something that I can really call my tradition? Or, if it's something that I want to pass on to somebody, do I have to change the tradition in some way for me to be able to pass it on? Let's say if I have kids, and I think I settle on sort of this idea that I would, in order for it to be my tradition, it's still going to be something that kind of respects where it came from, but I would sort of at least put some of myself, my thoughts and ideas into making the bread. And I guess that's where it ended up. And I guess what it reminded me of, so for Passover, you've got like the Seder plate. I'm sure I'm butchering this, in which case somebody can correct me. But you're at Passover, you've got the Seder plate, and there was this comment that apparently somebody had made, which is that lesbianism in Judaism would be something like having an orange on the Seder plate. Like the idea being that like it's something that doesn't belong or seems out of place. But what happened is that there are now sort of many Jewish families that that now have an orange as being a part of the Seder plate. It's in fact part of the tradition that they now have. And sort of having gone through that experience and seeing in this case that, my new extended family were celebrating Passover, in this case, including the orange and the Seder plate, sort of acknowledging sort of my husband's and my marriage, sort of thinking about it in that way, it made me think, oh, like this feels like something that I can do, that I can sort of think about putting my own self into this bread recipe now, and then maybe it's something that I can pass on to my kids, or anyway, that's at least one thing that the video is about, I guess.
Yeah, I love that. I love the flexibility of religion and the flexibility of tradition. That's such a fun thing when I don't know, we can invite more people to that table with us.
Yeah.
Huh.
Well, I mean, and I there's still a lot of that I have to really explore and think about, because obviously you don't there are going to be changes that would be too much, probably, right?
Right.
And how do you figure out sort of what ends up being too much, or sort of how do you figure out like what do you need to do to kind of respect the previous tradition that you had, and what are changes that kind of fit within that? It's a very weird puzzle that I don't really understand. I just feel like this bread is a good first step.
I think so. It seems like it'll pay off anyway. If you can solve the bread problem, that's a good building block.
It's super fascinating how you've worked out all those ideas around tradition. What a neat thing. Well, on that note, let's take a listen to the track "Arthur is at Shiva."
I was down at a work party last week to celebrate the end of the summer. Was the end of the evening then, and we were out at a bar up in Midtown. Jerry's feeling like chicken tonight, and he ordered some wings from the waitress. And then Jerry and I traded shots at the bar. It was the typical shenanigans. But where's Arthur now? Yeah, legendary tales from the work week, a strong mix of heroics and gin. I was drunk in the evening then, and that's when Arthur walks through the door. He says, I was just at a shiva today for the death of a good friend of mine. A towering figure in my early life, he was an excellent specimen. Hey Arthur, don't look away, no need to hang your head in disarray. You know that it's just
Well, maybe we can pivot back to talking about one of your songs here for a minute.
Sure.
I was gonna say this is like one of my favorite songs in the album, but I think they're kind of all my favorite song on the album. But this one particularly sticks out to me because, man, there's this phrase that I think really catches your ear when you listen to it. It's the final song of the album, and it's called "Super Kamio Kande." And I guess if you have no idea what that is, dear listeners, Super Kamio Kande is a neutrino observatory that does a whole lot of science stuff. I couldn't really tell you what it is, but Andrew, maybe you can tell us in a minute. I love this song for a lot of reasons, because at first it was just a cool song and I liked it, and then I had to go look up what the Super Kamio Kande was, and I learned this. I just fell down this big rabbit hole of great science things. So among the things it does is that it detects like supernova in our galaxy, and the cool thing about the song is that like you interpret this through this like very interesting religious lens, kind of mashing up the science and the religion. So, you know, in your song, you describe it as this observatory as being a watchful eye that's like looking out for all of us. So, I don't know. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about like how you've paired up science and religion in this song, and I don't know, how does that work out?
So I mean, I'm really not a science person. Like, I mean, I think science is cool, and I'll read like cool science articles and whatnot. But the way that I got involved in it is that my former housemate, she is now a professor of like particle physics at Oxford, but she studies particle physics, and amongst them neutrinos, and had introduced me to this one experiment in South Dakota, which is where I'd gone on my honeymoon, called the homestake experiment, where it's a very similar experiment to Super Kamio Kande, which is in Japan, where they use just a lot of different chemistry and a lot of physics stuff to help detect neutrinos, which are apparently like next to impossible to detect. Otherwise I would probably there would be no way that I could even write this song in the first place. But I mean, I think it's not like I think the song is not about how the homestake experiment and Super Kamio Kande will use neutrinos to detect God. It's not anything like that, but it's more. I think what it did was my experience going to the homestake experiment was the homestake experiment was very inspirational, I guess. And I think the best way for me to kind of explain what was going through my head writing the song was that, in like medieval times, they built the cathedrals with the spires that pointed upwards, and the effect of like going to the cathedrals and seeing the spires pointing upwards is that it gives people a lot of inspiration. And I think, for lack of a better word, looking at space stuff, it really gives me that same feeling. And going to the homestake experiment and reading about Super Kamiokande, they're using neutrinos and like studying them. It's possible that it might, help people learn about dark matter and dark energy, and like how the entire universe is constructed, and how, what's going on with like all these galaxies like very, very far away. I find that just even thinking about those kinds of things, I get a lot of the same feeling that I get when I see a cathedral and I see those spires. And so I think that song, when I think about, I guess going back to the beginning, when I think about what I don't necessarily like about modern pop rock praise music, is that I don't have that feeling. And so I think it was important to try, and I think that song is probably the pinnacle, at least in the album, of like that kind of emotion. And I wanted to use Super Kamiokande and those types of experiments, and sort of thinking about space, to try and provide that same kind of feeling. And in that ways, I think that that's maybe that song sort of ends up being at least the best example that I have of writing a praise song. Although it is very abstract.
Well, I want to pick up on something you just said, actually, that I found really interesting. You mentioned it's hard to find that feeling expressed in a lot of pop music. And I think that's right. And it's a good excuse to ask you about your own kind of style, and how you've developed a way of expressing those ideas and feelings or sentiments. One thing I love about what your music is like. Well, my partner was asking me today at the dinner table. I was telling her, we're going to record this episode with this musician. His music's really neat. And she was like, "Oh, what's it sound like?" And I said, "Well, I think I just have to play it for you, because everything that I'm saying doesn't sound exactly right." I was like, "It's kind of like there's like some indie vibes in it, but it's not exactly indie music. There's some pop vibes in it, but I wouldn't call it pop music." Anyway, the way that you sort of string together melodies, and you have this kind of way of talking and singing at the same time, and you pace this rhythm in an interesting way. How are you maybe developing a musical language to put some expressive spin on these feelings that you're trying to convey in ways that maybe other pop musicians have a hard time putting together?
I mean, some of it's just that I have a very weird musical background. I grew up as a concert violinist. I was a very good concert violinist. I won like national and international competitions in high school. And learned music theory and whatnot. And when I got kind of reacquainted with music in graduate school, because I kind of stopped around the college years, I started picking up jazz. I went to jazz jam sessions and just kind of hung around with hard drinking, smoking jazz musicians in Columbus, Ohio for a while, and like sang standards with them. And I got involved in karaoke, and just I have a list. I have a list of over 500 songs that I can sing at karaoke. It's complete. I have a spreadsheet, and it's got like a star rating with how well I think I sung each song. But I do have a very extensive musical background, and just a lot of skills that I can draw on in trying to write music. I mean, and it's something that when I talk to other musicians, it's something that I always say. I mean, I think many musicians have a tendency that once, especially if they get involved in a certain kind of music, there's a tendency to kind of poo-poo other types of music. And I've never really taken that approach. I mean, some of it was I was very fortunate to have received a very good musical education when I was younger, which kind of allowed me to learn more about other types of music in kind of a meaningful way. And I guess because of that, it's I mean, like, I don't think about all of those things when I'm trying to write. I just really I have certain feelings, and then I just want to find the best way that I can express them. And I guess I've been very fortunate that I've been able to kind of develop a nice toolkit, a really expansive toolkit, actually, to try and put things together and try to say things in the way that I want to. Yeah. And I'll say, like, it's served me pretty well. Like I do, I have 4 different records where I talk about sort of a pretty wide variety of different things. In this record, in addition to just the other experience, maybe you can tell me what this is called. But a lot of my, like, melody and lyric writing, it's influenced by that one thing in church where the guy has, like, he's got like 50 syllables he's got to say, but there's like a set melody that he's got to, like, fit them in.
Yeah, like chanting or sung liturgy. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So there's that,
that really makes sense,
right?
Yeah.
So, like, I think going to church and being involved in that, like, that was an experience that really informed my music writing. And, like, you will see aspects of that in my writing, even though I hadn't really thought about it for a while. It just kind of ended up there, and it was like, oh, okay. Huh.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's super fascinating. I was always trying to describe how like your singing works in songs, and that might be the best way. That it's like like at church when you're singing the Psalms, and you got to have too many words in there for the melody or something. That's great. I love it. That's such a good explanation. Well, gonna pivot the conversation one more time here. So on our podcast, we usually talk a lot more about politics than this, but it's fine that we're not. It's actually nice to take a break. But when we first started talking, you linked me a song from from an older album called The Hungry Years, and the song itself is great. I think it's fantastic, but there's also this accompanying video that really, I think, drew me in, called "Why I'm Joining the Democratic Socialists of America," which is like a sort of like a narrative that you're telling in tandem to the song with the, like, in video. So the video is this, like, interesting diverging narrative that starts with the text: "This last week I received a sign from the Holy Spirit to join the Democratic Socialists of America." And first of all, it's a great bold line. I'm telling all my Christian friends this all the time, that the Holy Spirit's telling them to do this. Not a lot of them have caught on yet, but that's okay. Anyways, I'd love to hear talking more about that video. I don't know, where's the narrative come from? You have it, it kind of centers around this whole DSA march in New York City, and you have these, like, interesting imagery about these lions at the public library. So yeah, like, what's going on in this video for you?
Well, so the video is really about coincidence, and how coincidences are things that people take as signs of something much bigger. In this case, I try and write everything sort of from real life as much as possible. But the conceit of the video is that I've gone on this march with the DSA, in support of this housing movement, and I've become kind of fascinated with, it's taking place at the New York Public Library, and I've become fascinated with these lions that are in front of the library, and the coincidence, because I talk about the lions quite a bit in the video, but it turns out, and this was in fact a real coincidence. I didn't plan this at all, but the exact lion that I was filming for a fair bit of the video, one of its previous names was Lord Lenox, and I was like, what the? I just found that to be really shocking, and so like that ended up being kind of an overarching narrative for what was happening. I mean, it felt like it had to be a sign for something. But I mean, I think in general the video is more about finding a calling or inspiration, and how I think, being brave, is that and embracing revolutionary thinking, which refers to a line in the song. It's something that's very much a virtue that is called for in a lot of situations, especially dealing with when dealing with bad people. And in the context of the song, the protagonist is thinking about how being brave and revolutionary is kind of a necessity in dealing with not having a lot of means, and having to kind of barely get by. And then in the video, the protagonist is kind of confronted with how shitty the world is, and this is during the Trump years, and because of how shitty everything is, he's kind of embarrassed because he doesn't really know how to deal with all of it. And it's kind of through the act of going to this march that he gets inspired, seeing how brave the people are, and that's something that inspires him. And kind of figuratively for him, that means taking on the guise of the lion, in this case, one of the lions in front of the New York Public Library. Yeah, I mean that's essentially what the video is about. And I will say, I don't agree with everything that the DSA does. I agree with a lot of what the DSA does, and I'm still trying to be involved in a way that works for me, and I want to be involved as much as possible. But I think what the DSA does very well, like when it's doing firing on all cylinders, it's doing something that gives people inspiration to kind of think and hope about the future. And I think that's something that when everything's working right, that's what they're doing. And I find that to be very.
I dig it. I think you're right. When they are firing on all cylinders, I mean, it's clearly a transformative experience. Everyone I've ever talked to who's a member of the DSA in a meaningful way, it's always kind of like, well, yeah, the meetings are what they are, but it's like once you get in the street with a bunch of other people and you really get something done, you're like, all right, this pays off in a meaningful way. Well, as we're getting close to the end of our conversation here, do you want to make a plug for your new album, and where can people find this work, other work? What's the best way that folks could support you and get a taste of what you got going on?
Oh, well, I guess in context, I should say definitely don't go to Spotify. Go to Bandcamp or something else a little more friendly to artists. But I mean, you can find my records anywhere. I have this new record, 10 Songs of Worship and Praise for Our Tumultuous Times, coming out on June 11th on Don Giovanni Records. Really, I think it's great, and Don Giovanni does great work. They have a lot of queer and people of color artists on the label. And I will say, looking at the state of indie music, there are shockingly few Asian American music acts, and shockingly even fewer Asian American male acts on any sort of notable indie label. And so the fact that Don Giovanni has allowed me to be on the label and release records is a great thing, and great to sort of get some visibility out there. So yeah, June 11th. And there will be 2 other music videos coming out before the record is released. So there's the Arthur Zeta Shiva, which is the Baking Bread. There's The Great Blue Heron, which is it's going to be an extended interpretation of Song of Solomon, which you might find interesting.
For sure.
And then Teenage Eyes. Teenage Eyes is the 3rd single, and the video for that will be an extended discussion of death philosophy, and Dungeons and Dragons.
Nice.
All right. I'm here for it. Well, thanks so much for joining us. We'll make sure we link all of the stuff in our show notes, and we'll tweet it out and stuff on Twitter. But yeah, we really appreciate you joining us for the hour and talking through your album with us.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/themagnificast. Our music this episode is all Saint Lenox, all those great Saint Lenox tunes you've been hearing this whole time. It's fantastic. Cool. And we're going to close the album out with Saint Lenox, The Hungry Years. It's the song we talked about at the sort of close of the episode. All right. We'll see you next week.
The water tower had a station wagon, cardboard childhood. Then gotta turn the AC to the Raptors, boy. Gotta turn the heater down to the floor. We never had real nice things then, yeah. Hand-me-down clothes and big jar peanut butter. She grew up in a war zone then, with her army base stew and her rations in tins. Hey. You got your Christmas shopping at the discount store, and imagination birthday, holiday. You gotta study every day, maybe be a doctor. Gotta bring home the bacon to your wife. We never got Air Jordans back then, yeah. Homemade fast food, burgers on white bread. She says it's better than the real thing, yeah. But I know it's not the real thing, she knows. I know, you gotta save every penny and dime. You gotta save every minute and hour. You gotta scream like a woman on the verge of a nervous breakdown. You gotta save every dollar and cent. You gotta save every hour and day. You gotta shout like a goddamn revolutionary. Hey! Put on a sweater in February and take it all off in the summer. Yeah, frozen canned orange juice, powder lemonade, and margarine tastes like butter. We never had a real nice car then, yeah. Boxcar, Lumina, Datsun in the old days. She says it's better than the real thing, boy, but I know it's not the real thing. I know, she knows. You gotta save every penny and dime. You gotta save every minute and hour. You gotta run like he's gonna beat the shit right out of you. You gotta save every dollar and cent. You gotta save every hour and day. You gotta scream like a goddamn revolutionary. Hey! He's got a budget of whiskey and a bulk supplier. Got a houndstooth suit at the factory store. Got the display model at the supermart. Got the bruise box discount vegetables. She's got a coupon book for the end of time. Got her 3 kids yelling in the back